There are certain questions that, when asked, don't trigger honesty. They trigger defense mechanisms, not because the answer is unknown, but because the truth threatens identity, security, and emotional leverage. Today, we're going to explore why some questions are almost never answered honestly, not out of malice, but out of psychological survival. Emotional self-protection is one of the strongest forces shaping human communication. When a question touches emotional security, honesty becomes secondary to safety. This is not a conscious decision most of the time. The brain is designed to reduce psychological pain before it prioritizes truth. When someone is asked a question that could expose vulnerability, trigger conflict, or threaten attachment, the nervous system reacts first, and language follows that reaction. From a psychological perspective, honesty is not just about facts, it is about emotional consequences. A question like, "Are you truly happy?" or "Are you still attracted to me?" doesn't feel neutral. It carries potential loss, confrontation, or destabilization. The mind quickly calculates risk. What happens if I answer honestly? If the perceived cost is high, the answer will be filtered, softened, redirected, or avoided entirely. Emotional self-protection often begins with fear of abandonment. When emotional security depends on maintaining closeness, honesty can feel dangerous. The attachment system prioritizes connection over transparency. In such moments, the brain chooses responses that preserve stability rather than accuracy. This is why reassurance is often given even when uncertainty exists internally. Another layer is identity preservation. Certain questions threaten how a person sees themselves. Admitting dissatisfaction, attraction elsewhere, or emotional confusion can create internal shame or cognitive dissonance. The psyche resists information that disrupts self-image. Instead of processing the truth fully, the mind edits it into something more tolerable. What gets spoken is not a lie in intention, but a version of reality that feels emotionally survivable. There is also the issue of emotional labor. Many people learn that expressing raw truth leads to emotional chaos, arguments, or being misunderstood. Over time, the brain associates honesty with exhaustion. Emotional self-protection then looks like choosing peace over clarity. Silence, vague answers, or partial truths become coping strategies rather than manipulative tactics. Stress responses play a crucial role here. When a question activates anxiety, the nervous system shifts into defense mode. In that state, higher reasoning shuts down and self-preservation dominates. Words are chosen quickly, not thoughtfully. This is why people often say, "I didn't even realize why I answered that way." The response was physiological before it was rational. Emotional safety is also linked to power imbalance. When one person holds more emotional, financial, or relational power, honesty feels risky. Revealing inner truth can feel like surrendering leverage. Self-protection then manifests as emotional restraint. This is not about control, but about maintaining equilibrium in an environment that feels unequal. Importantly, emotional self-protection does not mean emotions are absent. In fact, it often means emotions are intense but unprocessed. The person may not yet have language for what they feel. When asked direct questions, they respond with what feels stable, not what feels accurate. Clarity requires emotional processing, and many people are questioned before that process has occurred. This dynamic explains why repeated questioning does not produce better honesty. Pressure increases threat, and threat increases defense. Emotional safety must exist before truth can emerge. Without that safety, the mind will continue to prioritize protection, even when honesty is desired by both sides. Emotional self-protection is therefore not the enemy of truth, but a signal. It reveals where fear exists, where attachment feels fragile, and where emotions remain unresolved. Understanding this mechanism shifts the focus from accusing dishonesty to recognizing psychological defense patterns operating beneath conscious awareness. Fear of judgment is one of the most powerful inhibitors of honesty. Human beings are wired to seek acceptance, and when a question threatens that acceptance, authenticity becomes emotionally expensive. Validation is not just attention or praise, it is psychological reassurance that one is valued, wanted, and secure. When honesty risks disrupting that reassurance, the mind instinctively searches for safer responses. Judgment does not have to be explicit to be effective. Often it is anticipated rather than experienced. Past reactions, subtle facial expressions, tone shifts, or previous conflicts train the brain to expect negative outcomes. Over time, the psyche learns which truths are safe and which ones come with consequences. When a question touches one of those unsafe areas, honesty feels like exposure rather than communication. Loss of validation is particularly threatening when self-worth is externally regulated. If validation comes primarily from how one is perceived by others, then truth becomes conditional. Answers are shaped to maintain desirability, emotional relevance, or approval. This is not deception driven by ill intent, but a coping mechanism designed to preserve emotional equilibrium. Social roles intensify this fear. Expectations around being understanding, loyal, nurturing, or emotionally consistent create invisible rules. Violating those expectations through honesty can result in criticism or withdrawal of affection. The mind internalizes these rules and preemptively edits responses to stay within acceptable boundaries. What is said is often what protects belonging, not what reflects inner reality. There is also a gendered component in how judgment is internalized. Emotional expression is often evaluated more harshly when it contradicts relational ideals. Admitting uncertainty, dissatisfaction, or contradictory feelings can trigger labels rather than understanding. Over time, the psyche learns that honesty invites categorization, while restraint invites acceptance. Fear of judgment is closely tied to shame. Certain questions activate shame triggers related to desire, independence, or emotional inconsistency. Shame narrows awareness and silences nuance. Instead of exploring complexity, the mind opts for socially correct answers. The goal becomes minimizing exposure rather than expanding understanding. Validation loss is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is subtle, less attention, less warmth, less emotional investment. These micro withdrawals are deeply felt by the nervous system. The brain learns to associate honesty with emotional distance. As a result, answers become calibrated to maintain connection, even if that connection is built on partial truth. This fear also affects self-honesty. When judgment feels imminent, individuals may not fully acknowledge their own feelings. If a truth threatens validation, the mind may suppress it entirely. In such cases, the answer given is not consciously dishonest. It is the only version of reality that feels emotionally acceptable at that moment. The paradox is that validation seeking reduces authenticity, yet authenticity is often what deepens connection. However, when emotional safety is inconsistent, the psyche chooses short-term security over long-term depth. Honest answers require a belief that acceptance will survive truth, and without that belief, protection becomes the priority. Fear of judgment does not disappear through confrontation. It diminishes through consistent emotional safety. When reactions become predictable and non-punitive, the nervous system slowly relaxes its defenses. Until then, honesty remains filtered through the lens of validation preservation, shaping responses that protect emotional standing rather than reveal internal truth. Social conditioning shapes how people communicate long before they become aware of it. From early development, individuals learn which behaviors are rewarded and which are punished. Over time, this conditioning becomes internalized, guiding responses automatically. Honesty is not evaluated solely on truthfulness, but on how it affects social standing. When a question threatens image, the response is filtered to protect perception rather than reflect inner reality. Image management is not vanity, it is social survival. Humans are relational beings, and acceptance within a group has historically meant safety. This evolutionary pressure still influences modern communication. People learn to present versions of themselves that align with expectations, norms, and values. When asked questions that challenge this presentation, discomfort arises and the mind instinctively adjusts the answer. Social conditioning often teaches that harmony is more valuable than transparency. Direct honesty can be labeled as selfish, insensitive, or disruptive. As a result, many individuals are trained to soften truths, delay them, or avoid them altogether. Over time, this becomes a communication style rather than a conscious choice. The goal shifts from expressing reality to maintaining relational equilibrium. Image management becomes especially pronounced in emotionally intimate situations. The closer the relationship, the higher the stakes. Questions about desire, loyalty, or dissatisfaction carry the risk of altering how one is seen. The mind evaluates not just the content of the answer, but its potential impact on status, admiration, or trust. What emerges is a socially acceptable version of the truth. Cultural narratives further reinforce this behavior. Messages about being good, understanding, or emotionally stable shape internal standards. Deviating from these ideals can trigger self-criticism and fear of rejection. When honesty threatens these identities, the psyche prioritizes consistency over authenticity. Answers are shaped to align with the role one believes they must play. Social media and public visibility have intensified image management. Constant exposure to curated identities trains the brain to think in terms of presentation. Even in private conversations, this mindset persists. People become accustomed to editing themselves, selecting which parts to reveal and which to conceal. Questions that demand raw honesty clash with this learned self-editing. There is also a fear of being misunderstood. Honest emotions are often complex and contradictory. Social conditioning favors simplicity and clarity. When a truthful answer requires nuance, it feels safer to offer a cleaner, more digestible response. The complexity remains internal, while the outward answer conforms to expectation. Image management can create distance from internal experience. When responses are consistently shaped by external standards, individuals may lose access to their own emotional truth. They begin to think in terms of what should be felt rather than what is felt. In this state, honesty becomes difficult not because of deceit, but because self-awareness has been compromised. The pressure to manage image is strongest when approval feels conditional. If acceptance depends on behaving a certain way, honesty becomes a liability. The mind learns to protect the image that ensures belonging. Over time, this protection becomes automatic, activated before conscious thought. Social conditioning does not eliminate truth, it reorganizes it. The truth exists internally, but it is expressed selectively, cautiously, and often indirectly. Understanding this dynamic reveals that silence, ambiguity, or socially polished answers are not signs of emptiness, but reflections of a deeply learned system designed to preserve connection and social stability. Internal conflict arises when desire and morality pull in opposite directions. Desire represents emotional truth, impulse, curiosity, and longing. Morality represents values, commitments, and the rules that govern acceptable behavior. When a question touches this tension, honesty becomes psychologically complicated. The mind is forced to choose between revealing what is felt and protecting what is believed to be right. This conflict is rarely conscious. Most people do not sit and weigh desire against morality in deliberate terms. Instead, the tension is experienced as discomfort, hesitation, or confusion. When asked direct questions about feelings or intentions, the answer that emerges is often the one that aligns with moral identity rather than emotional reality. Moral identity plays a significant role in self-perception. People want to see themselves as good, loyal, and consistent. Admitting desires that contradict these traits threatens that identity. The psyche resists this threat by suppressing, reframing, or denying the desire. What is spoken reflects who the person believes they should be, not necessarily what they feel. Desire itself is fluid and situational. It can exist without intent, meaning, or action. Morality, however, interprets desire as implication. A fleeting attraction can feel like betrayal. A moment of doubt can feel like disloyalty. When questions are asked, the mind often answers in a way that avoids moral self-condemnation. This internal conflict is intensified by rigid moral frameworks. When values allow little room for emotional complexity, honesty becomes dangerous. The mind learns that certain feelings are unacceptable even if they are natural. As a result, those feelings are buried or disguised. Answers become moral statements rather than emotional truths. Guilt plays a central role in this dynamic. Guilt arises not from actions alone, but from perceived violations of internal standards. When a question triggers guilt, the mind shifts into defense mode. Honesty feels like self-incrimination. The response is shaped to reduce guilt rather than increase understanding. There is also fear of consequence. Revealing morally conflicting desires can lead to loss of trust, altered dynamics, or forced decisions. The psyche may not be ready to confront those outcomes. In such cases, withholding or altering the truth feels like preserving stability while the internal conflict remains unresolved. Language itself struggles to hold contradiction. Admitting, "I care, but I am unsure," or "I am committed, but I feel something else," requires emotional maturity and safety. Without those conditions, the mind defaults to simpler narratives. Complexity is sacrificed for coherence. Over time, unresolved internal conflict can create emotional dissonance. The person may genuinely believe the answers they give because the mind has aligned perception with moral preference. Desire is not eliminated, but it is pushed into the background, influencing behavior indirectly rather than being acknowledged openly. Internal conflict between desire and morality does not mean one must be chosen over the other. It reveals the gap between emotional experience and ethical structure. When questions enter this space, honesty becomes less about truth and more about which part of the self is allowed to speak at that moment. Power dynamics influence communication more than most people realize. Power is not only about dominance or control. It exists wherever one person has more emotional influence, resources, or decision-making authority than the other. When a question is asked within an unequal dynamic, honesty is filtered through self-preservation. The response is shaped not by what is true, but by what feels safe to disclose. Emotional power is one of the most subtle forms. When one person is more invested, more dependent, or more afraid of loss, they hold less power. In these situations, honesty can feel risky. Revealing dissatisfaction, uncertainty, or conflicting emotions may threaten the connection. The mind learns to protect attachment by managing information carefully. Power also exists in the ability to withdraw. The person who can leave more easily, detach emotionally, or withhold affection holds a psychological advantage. The less powerful individual often senses this imbalance, even if it is never discussed. When asked questions, their answers are shaped to avoid triggering withdrawal. Silence or reassurance becomes a strategy to maintain closeness. Authority and expertise create another layer of power. When one person is perceived as more knowledgeable, more rational, or more emotionally stable, their reactions carry greater weight. Honesty in such dynamics feels like exposure to evaluation. The response becomes defensive, designed to avoid being corrected, minimized, or invalidated. Financial and social power further complicate honesty. When stability depends on another person, truth becomes conditional. Answers are calibrated to preserve security. This does not require conscious calculation. The nervous system automatically prioritizes survival. Emotional truth is postponed in favor of maintaining equilibrium. Power dynamics also shape who is expected to adapt. In many relationships, one person becomes the emotional regulator responsible for maintaining peace. This role limits honesty. Expressing raw truth feels like failing that responsibility. The mind learns to absorb discomfort internally rather than disrupt the dynamic. There is also the issue of punishment, subtle or overt. Past experiences of anger, withdrawal, or criticism train the brain to anticipate consequences. Even if punishment is no longer present, memory maintains the pattern. Questions activate those memories, and responses are shaped by learned caution. Power imbalances can distort self-expression over time. When honesty is consistently suppressed, individuals may lose confidence in their own perceptions. They begin to doubt whether their feelings are valid or worth expressing. Answers become increasingly vague, not because truth is absent, but because self-trust has eroded. This dynamic affects not only what is said, but how it is said. Tone, timing, and wording are adjusted to minimize threat. The goal becomes emotional containment rather than clarity. Communication turns strategic, even in the absence of conscious intent. Power dynamics do not always involve one person intentionally exerting control. Often, they emerge from differences in personality, attachment style, or life circumstances. Regardless of origin, their impact on honesty is profound. Truth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels unsafe when power is uneven. Understanding this dynamic shifts the focus from blaming dishonesty to examining relational structure. When power is balanced, honesty becomes less threatening. When it is not, self-protection governs communication, shaping answers that preserve stability rather than reveal inner reality. Human experience operates on multiple psychological layers. What a person feels internally, what they express verbally, and what they act upon are not the same process. Each layer serves a different function and is influenced by different pressures. When questions are asked, they often target one layer while ignoring the others, creating confusion around honesty. Feelings are raw, spontaneous, and often contradictory. They arise from emotional memory, biology, and immediate context. A feeling does not require permission to exist. It can be fleeting or persistent, intense or subtle. Importantly, feelings do not demand action. They simply signal internal experience. Yet many people fear their feelings because they assume feelings imply intention. What is said is shaped by cognition and social awareness. Speech is filtered through judgment, values, and anticipated consequences. Before words are spoken, the mind evaluates safety, relevance, and impact. This filtering is automatic. When someone answers a question, they are not translating feelings directly into words. They are selecting language that feels manageable and appropriate. Actions represent another layer entirely. Behavior is influenced by impulse control, ethics, environment, and long-term goals. A person can feel something deeply and never act on it. Conversely, someone may act in ways that contradict their emotional truth due to obligation or pressure. Behavior reflects decision-making, not just emotion. Confusion arises when these layers are collapsed into one. Questions often assume alignment, that what is felt should be said, and what is said should be acted upon. This assumption creates pressure. If admitting a feeling is perceived as a commitment to act, honesty becomes risky. The mind then protects itself by withholding or altering the verbal response. Language struggles to capture emotional nuance. Feelings can be complex and simultaneous. A person can feel love and doubt, attraction and loyalty, comfort and restlessness. When asked to articulate this complexity, the mind simplifies. What is said becomes a summary rather than a full representation. Social expectations intensify this divide. Many environments demand consistency. Inconsistency is seen as dishonesty rather than emotional complexity. As a result, people learn to present stable narratives. What is said is adjusted to maintain coherence, even if internal experience is fluid. Fear also plays a role. If past experiences taught that expressing feelings leads to conflict or misinterpretation, the mind becomes cautious. Words are chosen defensively. The gap between feeling and saying widens, not because truth is absent, but because safety is prioritized.